Imagine stepping into a seam in the earth, a narrow cut where the world outside softens and the air changes. Walk with me a little while. Feel how the temperature shifts as we enter. Daylight becomes filtered, the sun a thinner ribbon above. The path narrows until it becomes a corridor of stone, and your footsteps become the only clear rhythm. One foot, then the scrape of sand, then the other. There is a hush here that isn't empty. It is a gathered sound, like breath folded close. This is the sea key. Let your eyes adjust. Notice first the coolness underfoot. The canyon draws in the heat like a soft hand, and a thin mineral scent rises from the sandstone, dry and faintly sweet. Run your fingers, if you can, along the wall. There's a texture, a fine grain that slips into the skin like powdered clay. Sometimes you will find mica glinting in the rock, tiny, scattered sparks that catch the light in unexpected flashes, like a handful of stars trapped in stone. Listen to the hush between the little noises, the small click of shoe against stone, the thread of wind that finds its way through the cleft, the distant, patient drip of water where channels and cisterns still work their slow, old routine. The Sikh is not merely a passage, it is an arrangement of feeling. At times, it narrows to a shoulder gap, a place where two faces of the earth lean close and the sky is nothing more than a strip of blue overhead. At other points it opens slightly, forming a short room of shadow where sunlight pours in from above and paints the sandstone in bands, like a tea poured over layered sugar. As we move, the light changes its mind about color. Where one curve of rock holds a warm apricot, a thin ledge a few steps further will be dusky rose. The canyon is an orchestra of tones, and each step yields a new note. Sooner than you might expect, the hush tightens into a kind of held breath. We are guided by the twist of the canyon. Our pace is lent to patience. There is a particular relationship between this route and those who once approached from outside. The Sikh is an entrance and, by design, a controlled reveal. For the Nabateans, it would have functioned as both approach and protection. A natural corridor softened and managed, a way to control what could be seen and when. The earth here offers its own theater, and the final curtain is pulled slowly, deliberately. Hold that breath a moment longer. There is a small movement of air that pushes over your face, carrying with it the faint sound of people where the canyon opens out. It is a sound that suggests scale, a murmur, the susurration of garments, the distant slap of sandal on open stone. Then the Sikh curves, and after its last deflection, the world opens. When the treasury appears, al-Khazne, there is a physical sensation that accompanies the sight. It is as if the canyon exhales, and the sight of the carved facade rushes in to fill the space. First, you see a plain of stone, its surface bright with a thin wash of sun. Then your eyes begin to pick out the sculpture, the columns, the pediment, the niches. Here is architecture made from the face of the cliff, a facade, an elaborate face, that rises in measured tiers, as if some patient hand had coaxed a building from the living rock. Stand with me a moment at the rim of that first impression. Notice the scale. The treasury is taller than a house. It is carved in stages, with a lower portico of columns and a broad, carved space above that is punctuated with decorative elements, rosettes, statues, though many are worn now, and a central figure that once dominated the composition. The weather has softened the sharpness of chisels. Edges are honeycombed where frost and wind have taken their slow toll. Yet the intent still reads, plain and direct. An entrance lavishly framed, an object that announces itself to whoever crests this natural threshold. Light plays across its face in a way that makes you want to move, just to see how it alters the details. At one pass, shadows pool in the recesses of the capitals. At another, the thin veins in the sandstone catch a warm pink that slides along as the sun shifts. Up close, the stone feels different from the canyon walls, more deliberate, dressed and smoothed by skillful hands. But there is no deception here. The whole thing has been carved from the same rose and cream bands that make the cliffs around us. It is a mirroring of geology and art. You will hear many names attached to this place. The Treasury is a modern label. People imagined it held hoards, perhaps because its facade suggests a house for valuable things. Archaeologists are cautious. The true function of the structure is debated. Some think it served as a grand tomb, an honor carved for the dead. Others suggest a ceremonial function. We can say with confidence that the Nabateans, the people who created Petra's rock-cut facades, were behind this and similar works. The Nabateans were not a secretive tribe of mystics. They were skilled engineers, traders, and artisans who made use of the available stone with great intelligence. Pause and listen. The echo here is different, as if the stone itself wants you to speak slowly. People stand and speak in low voices, and their words come back softened and round. You will find it hospitable to quiet contemplation, the kind of place that invites you to sit on a worn step, take a sip of water, and let your sight rest on the carved lines as if reading a very old, very ornate book. From the Treasury, the sight unfolds slowly. If you keep walking, the route takes you along the so-called Street of Facades, a stretch where many funerary monuments, each cut into the living rock, present their faces to the canyon. These facades are not identical. They speak in a related vocabulary, columns, pediments, and carved frames, but each one has its own proportions and its own degree of ornament. Here, the rock acts like a sheet of paper upon which generations left their signatures. Sometimes the faces are grand and formal, at other times intimate and plain. The royal tombs stand along this stretch, their high places carved with an intention of permanence. They are called royal because early visitors and local tradition associated them with leaders. Modern scholars prefer caution about who exactly lay within. What is clear is that these tombs were designed to be seen from below, and to make an impression on those who approached. Their upper registers and tall crowns read like a skyline of an imagined city, even when the interiors were never meant to be seen from afar. Think of them as monuments that make a statement about presence and memory. To carve a tomb into the cliff is to make loss visible. It helps the imagination to picture the living Petra in its fullness. Think of caravans slipping across desert tracks and arriving like patient tides. Camels, laden with incense, spices, textiles, or spices again, would have been guided by people who negotiated routes across Arabia and towards the Mediterranean. Petra lay astride trade corridors. It was a place where different goods, languages, and customs met. The Nabateans profited from and organized these networks. They were brokers of routes as well as makers of stone. Central to their success was water. Water is a quiet theme in Petra's story, but it is also the most decisive. These people were experts at managing scant and sudden rainfall, gathering it before it could run away and storing it for seasons that might otherwise be barren. The city's hydraulic technology combined channels, simple carved troughs that guided water, and cisterns, subterranean reservoirs that kept water cool and reduced evaporation. In the SIQ, you can sometimes see small grooves and channels cut deliberately to lead water to where it would be useful. Rain that falls on the high rims is coaxed down into pipes and basins, and that collected water supported households, gardens, and the caravan traffic that sustained a lively urban life. Imagine the sound of water in this context. Not torrents, but carefully measured trickles, the patient plink of drops, the soft wash against stone. In a place where water can mean the difference between stop and move, between growth and retreat, such management is as important as walls or towers. The Nabateans shaped their environment with this in mind. Wherever you see an artificial terrace or a dugout pool, read it as part of that conversation between human need and natural scarcity. The civic heart of Petra is not dominated by a single square in the way some cities are. Instead, it is layered, spaces for the public, for worship, and for performance. The theater, for example, is carved into the slope of the rock and would have seated thousands. Its arrangement shows that Petra was a place where communal life played out visibly. People gathered here for dramas or announcements. Stone steps stepped down into the hollow, and speaking carried differently in that carved bowl. Closer to the city's religious life stands Qasr al-Bint, a freestanding structure unlike many of the facades around it. Its plan and mass suggest an importance within civic ritual, and perhaps a central sanctuary in the urban layout. These civic and sacred spaces are not isolated artifacts, but parts of a city that worked. The theater emptied into roads that led to markets. Those markets were supplied by caravans that in turn relied on water stores and guides who knew when and where to travel. Picture a day where merchants, locals, and travelers inhabited these spaces with a rhythm of bargaining and conversation. Footsteps and the clank of small tools. The stone that feels mute to the resting eye was once bristling with small sounds. We must also consider the geology that gives Petra its voice. The cliffs here are layers of sandstone, banded in colors from creamy ivory to deep rose. This banding is not merely decorative. It records the history of the rock itself. Layers of sediment laid down, baked, and then rewritten by time. Weathering cuts along these bands, producing the rounded bulges and softened steps that our hands now find so agreeable. Erosion is a slow editor. It has smoothed chisel marks and softened faces, but it has also accentuated those incidental veins of color that make the cliffs look as though a painter has swept a broad brush across them. Sun at different hours brings out different hues. Early morning gives the cliffs a cool blush. Midday can wash them bright and almost bleached. Late afternoon pours a denser, warmer pink that seems to deepen into what travelers long ago called rose red. That phrase is apt because it captures both the gentleness and the intensity of the stone's hues. Light is the sculptor's ally here. A column carved in shadow is white-gray. The same column half in sun is a warm, tender red. When I walk among these carved facades, I often think in small domestic terms. The worn step that makes a good seat, the small niche perfect for placing a water flask, the flat ledge that becomes a place to rest a palm. These are the small comforts of an ancient city. It is, in a sense, the human scale that keeps a place alive in our minds. We imagine someone long ago pausing in exactly the same manner, leaning back against the stone for a moment to let the sun warm their face. There is another continuity to acknowledge. The people who have lived with and tended Pegasus, Petra, throughout the centuries. Among them are the Bedouin communities, whose knowledge of the land has been a living thread. Their connection to the site is complex and modern and rooted in everyday life. They have acted at times as guides, custodians, and interlocutors for visitors. At other times their lives went on beyond the gaze of travelers, with practices and needs that deserve respect and not romanticization. It is important to recognize that Petra is not a stage frozen in time, but a place where history and living culture meet. You will read in many accounts about rediscovery. The name most commonly attached to that act is Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss traveler who, in the early 19th century, is credited with drawing European attention back to Petra. He arrived disguised as a pilgrim, and, by his own account, persuaded a local guide to lead him to the site. The story is part of the larger narrative of how Petra entered the Western imagination. However, it is also important to remember that rediscovery in this sense means bringing a place into a different audience's view. It does not mean the site had been truly forgotten by those who lived nearby. Burckhardt's accounts opened a chapter of scholarly interest and of travelers arriving with sketchbooks and instruments. Those early travelers left us a range of impressions, some admiring, some hasty. They also brought with them the beginning of modern archaeology in the region. Systematic study of Petra's monuments developed slowly, shaped by changing methods and by the sensibilities of time. Today, conservationists and archaeologists work carefully to understand and preserve what remains, balancing the site's popularity with the need to protect it. Petra is on UNESCO's World Heritage List, an acknowledgement of its universal value and a call to stewardship that crosses borders and times. That status brings attention and aid, but it also brings the challenge of ensuring that care is respectful of both the ruins and the people who live near them. As we continue our walk beyond the initial sweep of facades, notice the pattern of the carved streets and the ways light falls into interior courtyards. Some of these enclosed areas would have been domestic or commercial, small rooms opening onto alleys where goods were bartered, and small fires cooked bread and stew. Think of the smell of baking, the heat contained in a small courtyard, the play of shadow across packed earth. A city is made of such moments. The big monuments give it identity, but the small daily acts give it life. Not far from the core facades, you will find the theater's seating softening into the slope, and the earth around it terraced for homes and workshops. Rubble and fragments collect here, evidence of the many hands that altered and reworked the city across generations. That accumulation is a kind of palimpsest, the written record of successive lives and changes. When an archaeologist uncovers a fragment of pottery or a worn loom weight, they are listening for the ordinary sounds of time. Not the dramatic shout of history, but its continuous domestic murmur. The street of facades leads us towards high places too, and one of my favorite motions when visiting Petra is to turn away from the principal thoroughfare and start to climb. The path rises gradually at first, then more steeply, following steps carved into the rock or worn by countless passages of foot and camel. There are small resting stages on the way, flat stones that invite you to stop and look back. From each of these you can see the city peel away in layers, terraces, facades, the distant spread of modern village roofs. Each pause allows light to rearrange the colors, and each view frames the city in a new way. The monastery, Ad Dare, sits high and blunt, like a grand old vessel settled against the rim of the world. It is more austere than the treasury, its carvings broader and more monumental. The approach requires effort. The climb frames the experience so that when you first glimpse the monastery's face, you have earned the sight. That physical work sharpens the sense of scale. From below, the monastery reads as a heavy, dignified mass, an assertion of presence at the city's edge. Climbing towards it, you notice the ways people have made temporary camp on ledges, spreading cloths and sharing simple food. There is a tenderness in these small gatherings, a cup of tea passed around, conversation that leans into the wind. For a moment the modern and the ancient meet quietly, and yet the climb also encourages solitary reflection. As breathing becomes steadier with the incline, the sound of the city below softens, replaced by a broadness of air and the thin, far call of birds. We have been walking some time now. There is a rhythm to the steps, a small chorus of stone and breath, and as we negotiate a steep stair or skirt a narrow ledge, the view opens to reveal how Petra sits within its landscape. It is not an island. It is cradled by the surrounding granite and limestone hills, which stand like a protective ring. From above, the city appears part carved, part built, a human story written into geological argument. The interdependence of the human and the natural is clear. The people shaped the water shaped where they could live, and the rock provided the most permanent canvas they could imagine. Before we climb higher, take another long breath with me. Listen for the faintest details, the scrape of a small stone tumbling away, the almost inaudible tick of parched plant against sand, the wind's thin song along a ledge. There's a kind of hush that gathers in high places, as if the world narrows itself to make room for reflection. Up here, the city's noises are at a distance, and you can measure time by the movement of light across stone. There is much more to explore. Narrow alleys that lead to forgotten terraces, small chapels hewn into niches, channels that still collect rain. But for now, with the monastery growing larger ahead of us and the horizon broadening beyond, let us prepare to take the next stretch of the climb. Keep your footing sure. The steps are worn and irregular, each one a marker of 1,000 small acts. Ahead, the path rises, and the light will begin to change again. The view from the next ledge promises a different understanding of Petra's scale, and there are corners of the city still wrapped in shadow that we have not yet seen. We will pause there, where rock and sky meet, and look back across the city as the sun moves toward its later hour. If you are finding this slow walk nourishing, and you like these long, quiet journeys into places that make the ordinary world feel thinner for a moment, consider subscribing. There will be more walks like this. We continue upward, the monastery growing in the distance like a promise kept. The climb is a ritual. Step, breathe, step. A small, steady conversation between body and stone. Each flat shelf becomes an excuse to turn and look back. From one ledge, the treasury seems a tiny, ornate tooth in the wider jaw of the valley. From another, it is a pale, folded book still unread. The light keeps rearranging the city so that every glance is a different page. At the monastery, the approach narrows and then frees. There is a long, last slope where the air thins slightly, and the wind, which felt busy lower down, becomes a single, deliberate voice. When the facade first clears the rim, it is less elaborately carved than the treasury. Its scale is the thing, broad, blunt, severe in a calm way. The rose and cream bands of the sandstone run across its face like an undressed cloak. Its doorway is generous. Nearby, ledges catch the sun and become small, private theaters for rest. People sit here, legs folded, a cloth between them and the stone, and share tins of tea, slices of bread, the quick intimacy of travelers on a hill. Sit with me on one of those ledges. Feel the heat held in the rock where the day has rested. Put your palm on the stone. It is warm as an ungloved hand. Look outward. The city below is a tessellation of light and shadow. Valleys fold into one another. The riverbed, now dry for the most part, threads like a silver seam in the distance. The view teaches scale. What felt monumental from below becomes part of a larger grammar of place. The monastery looks less like an individual and more like a punctuation mark in a long sentence of cliffs. Here, where the air thins and the sun eases toward late afternoon, time becomes a slow, deliberate thing. The wind carries a faint, dry scent, somewhere between sun-warmed dust and pressed herb. Beyond the human noises, there are small, natural sounds. A pebble clicking free and skittering, a solitary insect with a high, bright call. Farther off, the modern roofs of a village are visible, inconspicuous and honest, reminding us that life continues in these folds of rock. That continuity is important. It keeps the place rooted. As I sit, I think about the engineers of Petra and the handful of clever choices that let a city endure in this landscape. The Nabateans, whose name you will hear often when people talk about Petra, were less a closed people and more a networked civilization. They traded, they adapted, they learned. They looked at a rainfall and asked how to keep it, at a canyon, and asked how to make an entrance, at a cliff, and asked how to turn a face into memory. Water management was not a single invention, but a suite of practiced techniques woven into the city's plan. Walking the site with someone who knows the signs, an archaeologist or a local guide with patient knowledge, reveals a deliberate logic. Small channels cut into stone that carry runoff from roofs and ledges, terraces that slow down rushing water, settling basins where heavier particles could fall out before water entered a cistern, narrow, covered conduits that reduced evaporation and contamination. Where the Syke is furthest in, you can still find the vestiges of carved gutters, little stone gutters that once made deliberate music of water. A measured plink rather than a reckless rush. Think of these features as a kind of plumbing for an arid landscape, although plumbing sounds too modern and tidy. It was instead a layered, improvised engineering, trial, success, modification, grown from workmanship and observation. Dam-like walls were built to divert sudden floods. Cisterns were lined with hydraulic plaster whose ingredients have been the subject of recent research. Pipes sometimes carried water for small distances. All of these features reduced risk and increased the city's capacity to hold people through dry seasons. This mastery of water had practical consequences. It allowed gardens to grow in courtyards, which in turn cooled houses and produced small culinary herbs and fruit. It allowed caravans to linger. And, crucially, it let Petra be more than a seasonal camp. It let Petra be a city people could call home. The interplay between geological features and deliberate engineering is what makes Petra feel both like a natural formation and a crafted place. Below us, the theater is a reminder of the civic life such engineering enabled. Carved into the side of a hill, its rows of stone benches step back into the slope, and you can imagine a crowd leaning forward to catch a phrase or a trumpet. The acoustics of carved bowls such as this are part of why the Nabateans chose these shapes. Sound carries differently when it is framed by rock, and a voice can reach far without being loud. Nearby, Qasr al-Bint stands as a structural counterpoint, a freestanding building with a solidity that speaks of different kinds of craft. It is often called a temple. Its plan and the traces of its foundations suggest it had religious importance. Yet how exactly it functioned in ritual terms remains a careful subject for scholarship rather than a story of certainty. When we come down from the monastery and find our way into inner courtyards, the change is intimate. These pockets, some roofless, some half in shadow, feel domestic. Often you will find niches that might have held lamps, shelves for storage, and traces of altered floors that speak of repeated use. Small finds, shards of pottery, a fragment of a bead, have been excavated and catalogued, each one a small voice testifying to daily routines. Archaeologists gather such fragments like sentences, assembling them patiently into paragraphs that tell a human life. The recent history of Petra's study is a story of shifting approaches. After Burckhardt's report in the early 19th century, he brought word of the site to a European audience. The place attracted scholars, artists, and travelers. Picked through by sketchbooks and early descriptions, Petra entered a long period of attention that eventually matured into archaeology. Over the 20th century, methods advanced. Stratigraphic excavation, careful recording, conservation-minded approaches that ask not simply what can be taken out, but what must we preserve in situ. Excavations were at times driven by curiosity, at times by grander, less careful ambitions. Fortunately, in recent decades, there has been increasing emphasis on conservation and interdisciplinary study. These days, teams made up of local Jordanian archaeologists and international collaborators work together, combining field methods with geological analysis, hydrological modeling, and small-scale experimental archaeology to test hypotheses about how Petra functioned. UNESCO's inscription of Petra on its World Heritage List in 1985 marked a formal recognition of the site's outstanding value. That status brought important resources and attention, but also greater visitor numbers and new management challenges. Conservation is a delicate practice here. The very act of visiting, the brushing of hands across carved surfaces, the footfall that loosens crisp sand, the increase in localized humidity caused by breath and proximity, can accelerate decay. Conservationists must balance accessibility with protection. Sometimes a path is rerouted, a fragile facade is fenced, a drainage feature is repaired to reduce erosive flow. At other times, the decision is to monitor rather than intervene, to watch how a minor fissure behaves over a season before choosing a course of action. It is a slow, careful work that depends on scientific study and on collaboration with local communities. Speaking of local communities, the Bedouin people who have lived in the area for generations are a living link between Petra's deep past and its present. Their knowledge of the landscape, the ways to read a sky for rain, the best routes across terrain that look deceptively uniform to a stranger, has always been part of Petra's story. In the early days of European rediscovery, Bedouin guides and intermediaries often helped visitors access the site. Over time, their role shifted. Today, many members of Bedouin families are involved in guiding, in small-scale hospitality, in local crafts, and in conservation projects. There are initiatives that work with local communities to promote sustainable tourism, offering training in conservation techniques and creating economic pathways that do not depend solely on unregulated visitor numbers. It is important to speak of this relationship with nuance. The Bedouin are not a monolith. Their lives are varied, shaped by individual choices and broader economic pressures. Some have embraced opportunities in tourism and education. Others maintain livelihoods that are not directly connected to visitors. Conservation efforts that are sustainable must take these realities into account, supporting local livelihoods while protecting fragile heritage. When I talk with guides who grew up nearby, I hear a mixture of pride in the place and concern for its future. That combination is, in its way, another kind of stewardship. People who feel responsible for a landscape because it is part of their family's story. Walking Petra gently also means understanding the pressures modern tourism places on the site. The paths carved by ancient feet now bear many more steps. Horses, donkeys, and camels, long used to carry people and goods, remain part of the visitor experience, but their use must be managed carefully to prevent damage to worn rock surfaces. Visitor numbers spike at certain seasons and times of day, which concentrates wear and challenges the fragile balance of microclimates across facades and interiors. Dust from roads and the emissions of modern vehicles can change the chemistry of stone surfaces, increasing weathering processes. Conservationists study these effects and recommend measures: controlled access to sensitive areas, the use of alternative routes for pack animals, timed visitor entries, and surfaces stabilized with compatible materials. There is also a quieter, harder-to-measure change: the way that tourism shapes local expectations and uses of space. Where once a courtyard was primarily domestic, it may be repurposed as a resting point for a visiting crowd. Where once a small workshop might have produced goods for neighborhood use, it may instead cater to a tourist market. These shifts are not inherently bad. Economies change, people adapt, but they underline why conservation is not merely technical. It is social. It is about supporting communities so that heritage can be valued in multiple ways, not merely as a commodity. Amid these larger concerns, small human moments continue to give Petra its texture. On a morning I once visited, a woman from a nearby village sat on a low ledge and repaired a net. Her fingers moved with calm attention, knotting and teasing apart the fiber. A child ran past with a bright piece of cloth flapping, laughter cutting clear and short in the hush. A guide pointed out a tiny carved niche and told me how, decades earlier, his grandfather would leave small tokens there. These gestures bind lives to place. They are ordinary acts that keep memory alive, perhaps in ways that official records never capture. The practice of archaeology itself has become more collaborative and more reflexive. There was a time when a foreign mission might dig and remove objects for distant museums. There is now a stronger ethic of local curation and shared research. Museums within Jordan and community-driven exhibitions allow objects to remain close to their contexts. Fieldwork frequently includes training for local students and public outreach to ensure that research findings are communicated in accessible ways. This shift is meaningful. It recognizes that the past is not only an academic interest, but a part of living identity for people in the region. If you walk further inland from the main tourist paths, you sometimes find small, lesser-visited features that repay attention. A garden terrace, patched with a few surviving fragments of an irrigation channel, can be wonderfully instructive. A narrow passage that opens into a small chamber might have once housed a shrine or a simple household room. Each of these corners tells a small, careful story about adaptation. How people squeezed space from rock, how they learned to store rain, how they created comfort. Those intimate things help us imagine a Petra that was full of ordinary days: breaking bread, mending cloth, rehearsing a play, queuing for water at a cistern. One of the gentlest pleasures of visiting Petra is to let the light reach you there. There are moments, especially late in the day, when the cliffs take on a depth of color that feels almost private. The rose and cream change to a thicker, more resolute red. Shadows deepen into velvety purple. If you time it right, you witness the slow dimming of the carved faces, like reading a book as dusk closes the cover. From some viewpoints, the monastery holds a particular glory at these hours. Its broad facade glows softly, like a lantern made of stone. Descending is always a different kind of experience. The return through the city compresses memory. You have seen a wide panorama. You now move back into the intimacy of carved streets. The small sounds sharpen, the scrape of soles, the tinkle of a chain, a voice lowered in conversation. As you re-enter the Sieg, your body remembers the earlier sense of being enclosed. Now, the canyon feels familiar. The contrast between the open view of the monastery and the narrow fold of the Sieg emphasizes Petra's skill at staging experience. Long approaches that culminate in revelation, narrowness that heightens anticipation, and open spaces that allow memory to widen. There is something about walking back through the Sieg that feels like folding a letter closed. The sandstone walls gather the day's remaining warmth and then let it go. Light becomes a thinner ribbon above. The riverbed's faint scar runs like a memory underfoot. The crowded textures, mica glints, little carved niches, shallow grooves, become more intimate as you pass. You hear the echo making small music of footsteps, as if the place rehearses its greeting. It is worth pausing once more near the point where the treasury first appears. Stand off to one side and allow your sight to rest on a half-carved niche, a weathered capital, a faint trace of pigment that clings stubbornly in a recessed corner. These are not less important than the big gestures. In many ways they are more poignant. The grains of sand caught in a chisel mark, the unevenness of a column shaft where a tool slipped and was forgiven. These are traces of human labor in the most literal sense. They remind us that whatever grandeur Petra presents has always been built by hands that knew the feel of stone. In thinking of Petra's future, the questions are practical and ethical. How do we allow people to experience meaning while preventing damage? How do local communities benefit from tourism without being overwhelmed by it? How can scientific understanding inform conservation without turning the site into a laboratory alone? The answers are not simple. They require patience, sustained funding, international cooperation, and, above all, respect for the site's social and ecological context. A few practical principles guide much of the contemporary conversation. First, interventions should be reversible where possible. When a mortar or stabilizing measure is used, it should not permanently alter the fabric of the rock in a way that later cannot be undone. Second, local voices need to be central to decision-making. People who live with the place have valuable insights about seasonal patterns, traditional knowledge of materials and practice, and the cultural meanings that any conservation plan must respect. Third, archaeological research is best when it is public-facing. Sharing findings in ways that are accessible helps build stewardship and reduces misunderstandings about the nature of the work being done. There are encouraging signs. Some conservation projects now combine scientific methods, such as 3D scanning of carved facades to monitor micro-movements, with community training programs that teach sustainable guide practices, craft skills, and small business development. Educational initiatives bring schoolchildren to the site in carefully managed groups, helping younger generations understand the value and fragility of what they live beside. International partnerships, when conducted ethically and transparently, can bring expertise and funding that support long-term preservation. Yet the challenges remain. Climate change, for example, alters rainfall patterns and can increase the intensity of sudden storms that the old waterworks were designed to handle only to a point. Increased temperature swings can accelerate physical weathering of stone. Human pressures, crowding, informal pathways, the growth of supporting infrastructure just outside the protected areas, require constant attention. Conservation is not a task with a final, tidy end. It is an ongoing conversation between people, science, and place. As the light thins and the cool of evening gathers, the site takes on a new mood. At times, when visitors depart and the last local vendors have rolled up their cloths, a small, voluntary quiet descends. The city seems to fold inward. In such moments one senses a generosity in a ruin. It is not merely absence, but an invitation to listen. If you stand in the treasury's shadow when the tourists have gone, the place feels large enough for thought. A single voice will carry farther than before, and the echo becomes a friendly companion. We should return now through that familiar seam, the Seek, letting the canyon shape our departure as it shaped our arrival. The walls slim, the light narrows, and the air cools by degrees. The music of the passage is reassuring. The measured rhythm of footfall, the occasional faraway call, the persistent hush that seems to recognize and keep the small sounds safe. Think, briefly, of what you will carry away from this walk. Perhaps an image of rose-red stone lit by a low sun, a memory of a narrow passage that opens into a carved world, or the quiet knowledge that a city was made by practical hands and stubborn thought. In that carrying away, there is also a responsibility. Petra is not simply a scenic backdrop, it is a landscape of choices. How we visit can either harm or help. A careful visitor learns to step lightly, to let the stone be, to ask guides about conservation, and to listen to local voices. If you feel moved to learn more or to support preservation, seek out reputable organizations and community-driven projects that work on the ground. Read about the scientific studies and the local initiatives that prioritize education and sustainable livelihoods. Do not reduce this place to an image to be consumed quickly. Rather, allow it to be a doorway to longer interest and informed care. As the canyon narrows and our walk draws toward the modern edge, one last image stays with me. Late afternoon light sliding across a carved cornice, pooling in a hollow where someone long ago placed a bowl, the faint line of a channel disappearing into shadow. It is a small tableau, but it contains much: craft, care, the practicalities of life in a hard place, and, threaded through all of it, a human desire to shape the world with intelligence and beauty. When you step out into the open air again, take a deep breath. Notice the fresh, higher brightness. Let your eyes widen to the expanse. Keep the hush we found inside the Sikh in your posture as you move on. And, if the visit has left a small ache or a new curiosity, let that be a kind of generosity. A wish to know more, to give attention, to support those who keep such places alive. If you would like to follow more journeys like this, and to learn ways you can engage responsibly with heritage, please follow the link in the description to recommended resources and organizations working on preservation and community support. Thank you for walking this seam in the earth with me. let the last light you saw here linger as a small companion in the days to come. A quiet reminder that places like Petra are both the work of countless past hands and a trust held for the future.